I want you to imagine, just for a second, a devastating global famine.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a heavy way to start.
Right. But picture this specific scenario. The grocery stores in your neighborhood are completely stocked.
Okay.
The reservoirs are brimming with fresh water, the supply chains are running perfectly, and the fields are just, bursting with wheat.
So it's not a food shortage.
Exactly. The famine we are exploring today on this July 6, 2026, deep dive isn't a shortage of calories at all. It's a famine of words.
Man, it's a profoundly unsettling image to start with. Just the concept that a population could be physically full, incredibly comfortable, surrounded by all this abundance, and yet, starving to death on a much deeper, unseen level.
Yeah, that paradox is the exact premise of today's source material. We are looking at a highly intense, deeply metaphorical theological transcript, and it just completely redefines the concept of spiritual nourishment.
It really does.
I mean, it takes assumptions you might have about religion, about reading historical texts, and even, the everyday act of eating, and it just flips them upside down.
Totally. Though before we go any further, I think it's important to lay out a quick disclaimer for you listening.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good call.
So today's source is a highly specific, very intense theological text. Our goal today isn't to preach its theology or, endorse its specific worldview as absolute truth.
Right, we're not telling you what to believe here.
Exactly. Instead, we're treating this as a fascinating philosophical and psychological puzzle. The author is making some very sharp arguments about how human beings consume information, and we're just going to impartially unpack those arguments.
Yep. Our mission today is to look through the lens of this author to evaluate our own, information diet, I guess you could call it.
I like that phrasing.
Thanks. We want to understand their definition of what it really means to be hungry and figure out how they distinguish between information that gives us life and information that secretly starves us.
And the source builds its foundation on a specific biblical framework. For instance, the author draws heavily on the book of Amos chapter 8, verse 11, which literally predicts a famine of hearing the words of the Lord.
Right, so that's where the metaphor comes from.
Yeah, but the underlying mechanics the author is describing, like how we discern truth from fiction and depth from superficiality, those apply to how we consume all complex knowledge, not just theology.
So to understand this invisible famine, we have to establish what the author actually considers food. The transcript points to the book of Matthew, chapter 24, which describes a faithful servant tasked with distributing food in due season.
And the speaker in our source is adamant that this has absolutely nothing to do with literal grain or bread.
Nothing at all.
Right. The food in this framework is the word of truth. And the author categorizes the information we consume into two distinct buckets.
Okay, what's the first bucket?
First, you have God's food, which they define as ultimate truth with a capital T. It's the kind of profound understanding that provides eternal spiritual life.
Okay, got it. And the second?
Second, you have the devil's food, which is just non-truth.
The really dangerous part about that second category is the deception, right? The author emphasizes that the devil's food doesn't look like poison.
Not at all. It mimics truth perfectly on the surface.
Yeah, it uses the exact same vocabulary, it presents itself as super profound, but consuming it causes spiritual death.
And that visual similarity between truth and non-truth brings us to a fascinating argument the author makes about how we interpret ancient texts.
Oh, this part was wild.
Yeah, the speaker brings up John chapter 6, where Jesus famously tells his followers that to have life, they must eat his flesh and drink his blood.
Right, and the speaker just completely dismantles the literal interpretation of that passage, and they do it with a surprising amount of humor, honestly.
They really do.
They point out how absurd and frankly agonizing a literal reading would be. To make the point, they bring in this brilliant cross-cultural reference to the Buddhist concept of the 32 physical marks of the Buddha.
Which is such an interesting pull. For those who might not be familiar, in Buddhist tradition, a fully enlightened being is said to possess 32 distinct physical characteristics.
Right, like sacred markers.
Exactly. These are specific sacred markers, like a lion-shaped jaw, very specific bodily proportions, or skin the color of gold.
So the author essentially says, okay, if we take a teaching like, eat my flesh, literally, Let's apply it to any divine figure. Imagine taking a sacred figure with those 32 physical marks, slicing them up, and eating those sacred marks piece by piece.
It's awful to even picture.
It really is. It's this grotesque, agonizing, cannibalistic nightmare. The point the author is making is that Jesus obviously wasn't endorsing literal cannibalism.
No, of course not.
The flesh he was talking about was the words coming from his mouth.
Because taking those ancient words literally is, according to this text, entirely missing the spirit of the teaching. The words themselves are the life force, not the physical body.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author ties this back to a real-world physiological response that I found super relatable.
Oh, the illness analogy.
Yes. Think about a time when you, or maybe someone you know, got severely physically ill. One of the very first symptoms is a complete loss of appetite.
Yeah, you just don't want to eat anything.
Exactly. You could have your absolute favorite, most decadent meal placed right in front of you, and it just tastes like ash. Your body physically rejects it. The source uses that physical reality as a diagnostic tool for the spirit.
The argument being that if a person has absolutely no appetite for deep, challenging spiritual truth, if they encounter complex meaning and just find it tasteless, boring, or even repulsive, it's a massive red flag.
A huge red flag.
The text views that apathy as a primary symptom that a person's spirit is heavily diseased or, perhaps already dead.
The author paints this picture where a spiritually healthy person is essentially supposed to be a ravenous spiritual foodie.
I love that term, spiritual foodie.
Right. They should be constantly searching the menu of life for the next profound, life-giving meal. But here's the paradox that I found so compelling in this text.
Okay, what is it?
If this spiritual food is made entirely of words, how is it possible that words drawn from the exact same historical religious texts can be both a life-giving gourmet meal and a deadly poison?
Yeah, resolving that paradox is really the core thesis of the transcript.
How do they explain it?
Well, the speaker addresses it by leaning very heavily on a verse from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, which states, "The letter kills, but the spirit gives life."
Ah, okay. So we are dealing with a strict dichotomy here. The letter represents the literal surface-level text, and the spirit represents the hidden, deeper meaning.
Exactly. And the author takes that dichotomy and maps it directly onto the Genesis creation story. They draw a straight line between reading a text purely literally and eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
See, that is a wild reinterpretation to me. So they're saying the tree of knowledge isn't an actual tree with, like, a shiny piece of fruit hanging off it?
Not in this framework, no. The source equates the tree of knowledge of good and evil with false prophets who speak empty, literal words.
Oh.
It represents a superficial, rigid reading of text that ultimately brings spiritual death. Conversely, uncovering the true, hidden meaning, the spirit of the text, is what represents the tree of life.
I mean, I hear that, but I have to push back on the author's logic here a bit on behalf of you listening.
Sure, go for it.
If we're talking about mainstream religious teachers, people who dedicate their entire lives to reading these texts literally, they often seem incredibly kind.
They do.
Right. They run charities, they do good deeds in their communities, and they are teaching from the exact same book as the author. How can the source justify boldly calling them false prophets who are feeding people poison?
It's a tough critique, but the author justifies it by pointing to a specific historical example. The Pharisees in the first century.
Okay, let's talk about them.
To understand the author's critique, we really have to look at who the Pharisees actually were in their societal context. They held the highest religious positions, they memorized vast amounts of scripture, they strictly followed purity laws, and they were essentially the respected moral compass of their communities.
Right, so by all external societal metrics, they were pious and outwardly righteous. They weren't like criminals running around doing obvious malicious evil. They were the people you'd want as your neighbors.
Exactly. But according to the source, their external behavior was completely irrelevant to their spiritual function.
Oh.
Because the Pharisees were entirely focused on the letter of the law, just enforcing the literal, rigid text. So they were fundamentally incapable of saving souls. The speaker argues that external kindness or societal respectability simply does not matter if the core teaching you are feeding people is hollow.
Yeah, and the text uses this deeply unsettling metaphor to hammer that point home.
The steamed bun.
Yes, the steamed bun. The author says, imagine a teacher hands you a beautifully prepared steamed bun. The teacher smiles warmly, they pat you on the back, they ask about your family. You know, they are the absolute picture of politeness.
Sounds lovely so far.
Right, but the steamed bun they just handed you is entirely hollowed out and filled with toxic mold.
Ugh. It is a very stark visual, but it perfectly explains the author's mechanism of spiritual deception.
Yeah, it does.
The logic is that feeding someone dead, literal text, is the ultimate harm, regardless of the packaging. It does not matter if the poison is wrapped in a warm smile, or beautiful community traditions, or stunning architecture.
Yeah, the physical body of the listener might feel very comfortable and welcomed, but their soul is actively being starved to death.
But that presents a huge practical problem, doesn't it, for anyone trying to navigate this landscape?
Oh, absolutely. If true teachings and false teachings are coming from the exact same book and the people delivering them look identical on the surface, I mean, they're both smiling, they're both holding a text, they both seem like good people. How is a person supposed to tell them apart?
Right.
How do you spot the moldy steamed bun before you take a bite?
Well, the source provides a very specific mechanism for this discernment, drawing on the book of Job, chapter 34, verse 3. The text says that just as the palate tastes food, the ear tests words.
The idea that the ear tastes words is such an active, visceral concept. But practically speaking, how does that actually work mechanically? How do I taste a concept I'm hearing?
The text suggests it requires a highly active form of listening. You cannot be a passive consumer of information.
So no zoning out.
Right. Tasting a word means interrogating it as it enters your mind. You have to ask yourself, does this teaching challenge my foundational assumptions? Does it align with a deeper universal principle of life? Or is it just parroting a rigid literal rule?
That takes a lot of mental energy.
It does. And the speaker gives a stern warning against drifting with the current.
Oh, yeah, they use the imagery of dead leaves falling from a tree and just floating down a river.
Exactly. Think about a living tree. A living tree with deep roots stands firm and pulls nutrients from deep underground no matter how hard the wind blows or the water rushes. Only dead things blindly follow the mainstream flow without questioning it.
But what if your spiritual taste buds are completely numb? What if you've been eating the moldy steamed buns for so long that you don't even realize you're sick?
That is the big question.
Right. This brings in what might be the most memorable analogy of the entire deep dive. The dog food diet.
Oh, it's brilliant. What's fascinating here is how it perfectly illustrates the psychological barrier to accepting new truth.
Yeah. So the source asks us to imagine a person who has eaten nothing but literal dog food for their entire life. From childhood, that is all they have ever known.
Right.
To them, dry kibble is just what food tastes like. It's their baseline for reality. It feels normal, and more importantly, it feels safe.
Their palate is entirely conditioned to low-quality, monotonous sustenance.
Exactly. Now imagine you take that same person and you sit them down at a Michelin star restaurant. You put a complex gourmet feast in front of them, like a perfectly seared steak, artisanal cheeses, complex layered flavors, rich wine.
You'd assume they'd be thrilled, right?
You would. You would assume they would be thrilled to finally eat real food. But the source argues the exact opposite reaction would occur.
They would be terrified of the meal.
Completely terrified. They look at this complex, rich, real food, and their brain registers it as a threat. The textures are too unfamiliar, the flavors are too intense, the presentation is just overwhelming.
It's a sensory overload.
Yeah. The author argues that this person will actually reject the gourmet feast, push the plate away, and beg to go back to their familiar dry dog food.
And what's fascinating here is the author connects this psychological phenomenon directly to another biblical concept, casting pearls before swine, from Matthew chapter 7.
Oh, how do they connect that?
The logic here is that you cannot give a gourmet spiritual meal, meaning the deep, complex, true meaning of a text, to someone whose spirit is completely accustomed to eating slop.
Ah, because the pigs don't understand the value of the pearl. They just want their dry slop.
Exactly. And if you try to force them to eat the rich, life-giving food, they won't just ignore it. The complexity of the food confuses them, which makes them feel threatened, and they will ultimately attack you for trying to change their diet.
It's a wild analogy, but honestly, it is incredibly accurate for human psychology, even outside of theology.
How so?
Think about cognitive dissonance. How often do people reject a profound, challenging truth simply because they are too comfortable with their low-quality, highly familiar information diets?
Oh, all the time.
Right. When a real, challenging piece of truth lands in our lap, it shatters our worldview. It feels like an attack, so we treat it like a threat. We demand to go back to the kibble.
Yeah, we really do. It suggests that escaping this famine requires a fundamental rewiring of our palate. We have to actively train our ears to tolerate and eventually crave complex truth, rather than just seeking out what feels comfortable or what just confirms our existing biases.
Okay, so if we accept the author's premise that we are in this invisible famine, and we know we need to train our palate to crave this gourmet spiritual food, how do we make sure we actually get it?
According to the source, we have to demand it every single day.
Every day.
Yes. And this leads the speaker to completely reinterpret one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible, the Lord's Prayer from Matthew 6.
Okay.
Specifically, they focus on the line, "Give us this day our daily bread."
Oh man, the author is incredibly blunt about this passage. They argue that for 2,000 years, mainstream religion has completely missed the mark by treating this as a prayer for literal physical food.
Oh yeah, the text openly mocks the modern religious practice of praying over a quick lunch.
It's brutal.
The speaker talks about the absurdity of people solemnly bowing their heads to pray over a sandwich, a cup of coffee, or a piece of fruit.
Yeah, and the author even shares a humorous anecdote from their own childhood, talking about dropping a piece of food on the ground and jokingly calling it God's will.
Which is funny, but the core of the speaker's frustration is that people are treating God like a cosmic vending machine for the flesh.
Right.
The source points to another verse that says, God already knows we need physical food and clothes. The logic is, if you seek first the kingdom, all those physical things are added to you anyway.
So the theological argument here is that praying for physical food when you are already physically full, like sitting in a heated house with a full pantry, is a profound misunderstanding of the human relationship with the divine.
Exactly. It reduces the creator of the universe to a catering service.
That's a great way to put it. The author says that the daily bread we must aggressively seek, the bread we must passionately ask for every single morning, is daily spiritual truth.
Because that is the only food that actually cures the famine.
Right. So what does this all mean?
Well, the source sees a tragic irony in the modern religious world. People sit down at a fully stocked table, they clasp their hands, they pray a pious prayer over their physical food, and they feel incredibly righteous for doing it. But the source views this exact behavior as a symptom of a fat and lazy soul.
Oh, that's such a heavy critique. They are basically curating a fat physical body while housing a starving spirit.
Yes, they are obsessing over the physical, temporal world, while their spirit is absolutely emaciated from profound malnutrition. They are essentially begging for the wrong kind of bread.
It completely flips the script on what constitutes pious behavior. Someone might think they're being highly religious by blessing their lunch, but the text is saying, no, you're just distracted. You're focusing on the temporary while ignoring the eternal.
Exactly. It demands a total shift in daily priorities. The author is demanding that people wake up every day and realize that if they don't consume truth that day, their spirit is going to slowly starve.
It is an intense, unyielding call to action. The source isn't just offering a new academic way to read an old book. It is demanding a completely new way to interact with reality and consume information.
It really is a heavy framework, but the mechanics of it are absolutely fascinating to explore.
For sure. Let's quickly recap this journey we've been on through the author's mind today. We started by defining this invisible famine of words, where the physical world is full, but the spirit is starving.
Right.
We looked at the concept that the literal letter of a teaching can actually be deadly. The moldy, steamed bun perfectly disguised by a warm smile and community respectability.
And then we explored the absolute necessity of using our ears to actively taste truth. We discussed the danger of being dead leaves drifting with the mainstream current, and of course the psychological hurdle of the dog food diet.
Yeah, how we have to overcome our own fear of complex truth and stop settling for the comfortable slop we've grown used to.
And finally, we looked at the author's redefinition of our daily bread, moving away from treating the divine like a physical vending machine, and instead aggressively prioritizing the daily spiritual truth that keeps the unseen parts of us alive.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And the framework this author provides raises a critical question for you, the listener, to consider as you go about your day.
What should they be asking themselves?
Take a hard, honest look at your own information diet. Look at the podcasts you listen to, the articles you read, the conversations you participate in. Are you consuming media that actually challenges your fundamental assumptions, that forces you to grow, that expands your understanding?
Or are you instinctively reaching for the dog food?
Exactly. The comfortable, familiar, and ultimately empty content that just tells you what you already believe.
That active evaluation is the exact mechanism the author is demanding. But I want to leave you with a final thought that builds on this concept of the spiritual palate, something we haven't actually touched on yet.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if this author is right and our minds and spirits adapt to whatever we constantly feed them, consider the digital infrastructure of our modern world. Think about the algorithms that curate your digital life.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Right. Your social media feeds are mathematically designed to give you exactly what is comfortable, familiar, and agreeable to your existing biases.
They're built to keep you comfortable.
They are highly advanced dog food delivery systems. So in an era of infinite algorithmic content, where you aren't presented with a 204/7 all-you-can-eat buffet of information, are our modern technologies actively engineering a global spiritual famine by ensuring we never have to taste a difficult truth ever again?
Wow. That is a terrifying thought to leave on.
It is, isn't it? Well, keep digging deep, keep testing the words you hear, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.